Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking you through a little bit of an introduction into article writing in journalism. So in this video we're going to be learning about all the different sections that make up articles that are being written for the purposes of journalism. There is other different methods we could look at for different industries, but because we're focusing mainly on journalism, that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. We're going to be looking at how you could potentially structure an article for journalism, and the actual structure we're going to be looking at is going to be quite generic. It's going to be quite sort of a very typical way of structuring various different articles for various different types of journalism. And we're also going to be looking at some of the different ways that, effective ways that you can make your article have a bit more impact, and some of the considerations that you might need to consider before you actually start writing your article with regards to things like audiences and stuff like that. For this video, I'm going to be using this article that you can see on the right hand side here to show you the different terms that I'm going to be going through. It's not the longest article in the world, you don't need to read it, but I'm going to be using this to give you an idea of the actual structure of article, because it's quite generic, it's quite straightforward. It doesn't really do anything that's out of the ordinary, so it's quite a good article to use to get your head around the different terms that we're going to be going through. So we'll be jumping back and forth from this presentation to the article here on Photoshop, so I can zoom in, and show you the different bits that you need to look at. The reason why we're doing this is because the stuff that I go through in this video, these are the things you need to be thinking about when you're writing the articles for your Unit 26 and Unit 22. These are all the things that journalists are expected to consider when they write their article. It's not just going to be as straightforward as, sitting down, writing an article, there you go. There's so many different things that you've got to consider, which will impact on your grade. Okay? So the first thing we're going to look at is the actual structure of articles, okay, the way they're put together, the way they flow. And we're going to be looking at these 7 terms, which some of them you might recognise, some of them you might not. If you don't, that's fine, but some of them I'm sure you will have heard of. So we've got headlines, bylines, hook, stand first, main body, payoffs, and leadouts. So you can see here on the right hand side of the article where these different sections sit in various articles, okay? But I'll go over these in a bit more detail now for you. So the first one, and we're also going to be looking at what's called readability with regards to article writing as well. So for readability, we're going to be looking at register, mode of address, bias, elaborate and restricted code, and credibility. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go through these terms about structure. So I'm sure you all know what a headline or a heading means. Okay, you probably have done this before in something like English language if you've ever done things like news stories or something like that. But to put it very, very simply, the heading or the headline sits at the top of the story, okay, or the article, whatever it might be. And the purpose of the headline is obviously to introduce the reader to the topic and the tone of what the actual article is about. Okay, headlines are often deliberately written to be very punchy. Okay, they're designed to be something that can be read, digested, and understood in a matter of seconds. Okay, it should really give you an impression of what the article is about. Okay, obviously it's not going to give you that much detail that means you don't need to actually read the article, but it's going to give you a little bit of a flavour of the tone and the topic of the story to draw the reader in, to encourage them to read on and read the entire article. Okay, you will often see headlines that will use very, very limited vocabulary. They will be very, very concise, because the key to a good headline is to get across as much information as possible in a short space of time. Okay, the most effective examples of headline writing in terms of creativity is things like tabloid newspapers, okay, the Sun or the Mirror, okay, or the Daily Star. They're very good at writing short, punchy concise headlines, 3, 4, 5 words, give or take. Okay, they often use techniques like things like alliterations or puns or something like that, or something that's making reference to popular culture. Okay, to make their headlines more effective. Okay. So yeah, that's headlines. Really, really simple. Really, really, easy to understand. Okay, you should all know that one already. Hopefully, that's pretty much it, to be honest. Okay, even more simply, a byline. Now, a byline, these can vary in terms of the actual placement of the byline for their articles. But a byline, the clue is in the name, really. It's who the article is by and when was it written. Okay, hence why it's called a byline. All right. More often than not, they sit above the main body of text, so you will see the byline before the actual article begins, especially if the writer is quite well known, okay, quite a respectable, quite famous writer, then their name will usually sit at the top. Okay, sometimes if it's a slightly more inexperienced writer, you might find that their byline is just their initials, which is a bit of a kick in the teeth, but never mind. But you'll often find it either underneath the headline, above the stand first, around that sort of top area. And it might often have the date there as well, depending on what sort of publication it is you're writing for. So newspapers especially will have dates. A lot of web-based journalism will have the date on there as well. Magazines not so much, because they're a bit more infrequent in their publication. But certainly ones that are more news-based will have the date on there to make it seem a bit more, to make it so you can understand how up-to-date and accurate the actual story is. Okay, so a hook. A hook is not necessarily a part of the article that you can see stand out quite clearly. It could be one word, it could be a couple of words, it could be an entire sentence, but a hook is any part of the article that you would normally see towards the start of the article that is designed to draw you in. Okay, designed to draw the reader in and encourage them to read on. So you might often see a lot of hooks be integrated into the headline or stand first. Okay, it could be something that's a bit more sort of dramatic or shocking. It could be a big quote or something. Okay, and the reader's meant to go, oh, what's that about? I'm going to have a read of that. But often common techniques might be things like rhetorical questions are quite good ones. Enigmatic questions are always quite good as well. Okay, something that leaves the audience guessing. So if you look at this one here, this is the what I've interpreted as the hook from the article that was on the previous slide, where it says the Osbournes' eldest kid might be wary of reality telly, but the sometime actor also is a brooding pop rock under her Arrow moniker. Now I looked at that and it says things like wary of reality telly. Now that could be quite enigmatic. It doesn't tell you why this person is wary of reality TV. So I'm, as a reader, might look at that and think, oh, well, why are they wary of reality TV? I might read that to try and find out. Okay, so it leaves you asking questions. Okay, and the idea behind that is, read the article for those questions to be answered. Okay, quotes. Sensationalism is quite a common one you see in tabloid newspapers. Sensationalism basically means when a topic or story is exaggerated to the point that it is, almost blown out of proportion. It makes something seem more dramatic than it actually is. So it might be things like the language that they might use. They might use really shocking language to make something seem more dramatic than it actually is. Okay. Alright, stand firsts. Stand first, you will always, or more often than not, you will see a stand first right at the start of the article. And the stand first, or a lead you might also want to call it, is basically going to be the follow-on from the headline. Okay, whereas the headline is designed to give you a little bit of a flavour of the information about what the article's about, the stand first is designed to give you the rest of the information, to fill in the blanks essentially. Okay, it's almost a bit like an introduction to the essay. If you're writing an essay that you might have written for any subject at school, your introductory paragraphs would always introduce what it is you're talking about. It might introduce your main points. It sets up your essay, and a stand first is essentially the same thing. So you would often find that a lot of stand firsts will establish what we call the 5 W's of writing. Okay, which is who, what, where, why, and when, and how as well. If you want to make it 5 W's and 1 H. So especially you'll see this a lot in news stories. The first paragraph will explain those 5 W's. It will tell you everything you need to know about the story. Okay? that's essentially the point of a stand first, okay? It summarises everything you need to know first before leading into more detail in the main body. If it's something like an opinionated piece of writing, like an opinion piece, then it might often establish the writer's position about that topic in the stand verse as well, okay? So I'm not going to read out this entire stand verse here because I can't be bothered. But the basic flux of this particular article is telling you a little bit of an introduction about the person who the article is about. So it's about one of the children of Ozzy Osbourne, okay? It tells you about their life, tells you about, you know, their history, okay? And it essentially summarises the actual article in these 2 small paragraphs here, okay? Everything that you need to know in not massive amounts of detail, because that's the point of the main body, but it gives you, you know, a summarised version of the entire article, essentially. Okay, the main body is what we refer to as the main chunk of text, okay? It's the rest of the article, okay? You'd probably say it's probably about 75% of the article is made up of the main body, okay? Now, in terms of the main body, there's no specific rules of how you might structure your main body. It realistically is either it's up to you or it's up to the publication that you're writing for, because different publications will have different ways of structuring an article. It might also be depending on the type of writing you're doing as well, because say, for example, an interview article, the structure of an interview article will be very different than the structure of, say, an opinion piece, okay? However, what I've got on here is a few of the more common techniques that you might see with regards to main body, the structure of main bodies. So paragraphs is very, very important. We'll go over paragraph length a bit more later on, but what you will often find, especially in more long form articles, is that paragraphs will start off smaller to introduce you to you know, the writing itself, and then as you get further and further into the article, the paragraphs will get bigger. Okay, not massive, maybe 2 or 3 more lines, and they will gradually get bigger before gradually, you know, getting smaller again when you get towards the end of the article. It's not a specific rule of thumb, but you do see that very, very often. So the paragraphs will start off quite small, introduce you to the article, make it quite easy to get your head around, you know, the points or whatever, make it bigger as you go, and then shorter towards the end. Okay. Subheadings as well. Yeah, I'm not going to bother going through subheadings, but again, you'll probably more likely see that in more long form pieces of writing, not necessarily maybe a 300-400 word article. Paragraphing for impact as well. Paragraphs and sentence length for impact is something that you quite often see. If, say, for example, a writer wants to, you know, highlight a particular fact or stat or figure or whatever, they might often make that one sentence in its own paragraph, because what that does then is it draws the reader's attention towards that paragraph, okay? It gives it that sense of importance. Same with sentence lengths as well. You will often find that some sentences can be 2 or 3 words tops, and again, it gives it that impact, okay? But like I said, these aren't rules of thumb, okay? But these are common techniques that people do use for their main bodies of writing, but a lot of it will depend on what sort of publication it is you're writing for, because different publications, different styles will have their own techniques that they use. Okay, last 2, the payoff. You don't see these as much in news writing, okay, so factual writing, for example, but you do see it a lot in opinion pieces. So a payoff is almost like the conclusion of an essay, but it should be something that's, you know, punchy, okay, 1 sentence tops, okay, and it's designed to create that impact, okay. If you're looking at it from the point of view of an opinion piece, for example, it's designed to end the article, the argument dead in its tracks, okay. It's almost like you're putting a full stop at the end of your piece of writing, okay. So it's the final killer line. Alright, not something that you see very often in factual writing, okay. From the article on Ozzy Osbourne's child, I forgot what she's called, I sort of interpreted this sentence here, this quote actually, as being a bit of a payoff, because it says it will be ghostly and poetic with some neon and hypnotic laser lights to captivate all the senses. Now I found that could be a good example of a payoff, because it's a little bit sort of like, you know, surreal in the way it's written. Okay, it's a little bit sort of confusing in the words that they've used, because it is quite sort of psychedelic in the words that they use. So I thought that might be quite good for a payoff because it's a little bit sort of, oh wow, that sounds quite cool. Neon hypnotic laser lights. What's all that about? Okay, but not something that you see very often in factual writing. And finally, you've got the lead out. Now the lead out is very, very common. Okay, especially in things like promotional writing. But the lead out is essentially how can the reader interact with whatever the article is about. Now that can be about literally anything. Okay, if the article is about a product, it could be how can the reader consume that product. So say for example, there's an article that you're reading about Beyonce's new album that she's brought out, the one that's on Disney Plus. Okay, it might say, for example, at the end, Beyonce's album, whatever it's called, I don't know what it's called, can be streamed on Disney Plus from this day. Okay, it's almost like it's consumer advice for the person who's reading the article. It doesn't necessarily have to be something promotional, because obviously it'll depend on what the actual article is about. If it's about a certain person, it might inform you about how you can interact with this person. So for example, follow them on Instagram at this, whatever their Instagram name is, okay, or other social media platforms, Twitter for example, okay. It could even be something along the lines of further information. If you're reading an article on, I don't know, COVID, okay, it might end with something like, for more information, you can visit the NHS website and give you a link there. Okay, so it's sort of like, it's how can the reader interact with the topic that's being discussed. Okay, so again, this one that I found from the Ozzy Osbourne's child says, further teasers post on Instagram give her a sneak preview of what to expect. So it's encouraging you there to check out this person's Instagram, okay, and see what else they've done. Okay, the most common ones are things like release dates, okay, or I don't know, platforms for release. All right, you might find if you're reading a preview for a film or something, like you're reading a preview for Christopher Nolan's new film Tenet, the article or the preview might end with the release date. When's it out? When can you go and watch it? How can you go and watch it? Okay, but obviously it will depend on what it is you're writing about. Okay, so how can the reader interact with the topic being discussed? Okay, so now we need to move on to readability. Okay, so when we're talking about readability, we're talking about the actual style of writing. Okay, we're not looking at structure, we're looking at language this time. Okay, so let's go back to that list that we need to go through at the start. So we need to go through register, mode of address, bias, elaborate and restrictive code, and readability. So register is a nice simple one. Okay, register is the idea that when you're writing an article, you need to be putting a lot of consideration into who you write in the article for, and making sure that the way you write it is suitable for that audience. Okay, but we're not just talking about things like the language that you might use or the vocabulary. Yes, that is still very important, but we're also looking at things like the style. Okay, the sentence length. Are the sentences too long or too short? Okay, if you were writing an article that is going to be aimed at younger audiences, you would probably argue that your sentence length would need to be a little bit shorter, because it's stereotypical that younger people have less of an attention span. So it would be more difficult for them to focus and read an entire full sentence. Same with paragraphs as well. Okay, if you had short, punchy paragraphs, it makes it easier to read. More challenging pieces of writing for aimed at audiences that might, be a bit more intelligent. Okay. Are more likely to have longer sentences or longer paragraphs. Okay, we also look at clarity and conciseness. Okay, is it clear? Is it easy to understand? Conciseness, obviously, does it waffle? Okay, does it have the right sort of well, basically, does it go off on a tangent? Does it waffle or anything like that? Okay, vocab I've already mentioned as well. And syntax and punctuation, are all these things suitable for the reader? Okay, because every piece of writing will have a certain target reader in mind, and you've got to make sure that you've used the right register that's appropriate to that audience or that reader. Okay, mode of address. Mode of address means how does the actual article speak to the audience through the use of language. Okay, so these are the things that we look at. So we look at, is it direct or is it indirect? Okay, Again, obviously, it will depend on the actual publication you're writing for. So a direct piece of writing will more likely be using the you, we, I. It might use first person language. It might be more personal. It might have a peer-to-peer a mode of address to it. Okay, it might be something that's a bit more conversational, and the way you might chat with a friend, for example, or it might be indirect. News stories you probably find will be a bit more indirect. They might use they might use people and people's names. It might be a bit more impersonal because it's meant to be, projecting facts, for example. You might also find a piece of writing to be formal or informal. So when we're talking about something that's formal, we're talking about something that will use strict language rules. It will use, traditional English. Okay, you will probably find that more challenging pieces of writing are more likely to use more formal language. Okay, especially and more indirect pieces as well. So I'd probably argue that news articles, factual writing, so maybe some for the Guardian or the BBC, Telegraph, whatever, are more likely to use an indirect formal mode of address. Informal, you're probably more likely to find informal writing in things like soft news, so maybe things like tabloid newspapers, for example, or something like Heat magazine maybe. And they're more likely to be a bit more relaxed. They might use slang and abbreviations, colloquialisms, something that is less challenging. Okay, the way you might communicate with a peer, with a friend. The tone as well is something that that's got to be considered. Okay, what sort of tone is the writer going for? There's no particular rules in terms of what sort of tone you might want to have, but again, it will depend on the publication you're writing for. So again, more factual writing is probably going to be a bit more serious, but there's nothing wrong with having a piece of writing that's sarcastic or humorous, or opinionated, something like that. Informative, again, it's probably going to be more for factual news as well. Challenging or critical, things like that. So, again, it all depends on what the publication is you're writing for, okay? But you will need to make sure that you have used the right mode of address for the publication you're writing for. So say, for example, if you're writing a piece of hard news for The Guardian, it's much more likely you're going to be using an indirect, formal mode of address that probably has a serious and informative tone, okay? Whereas if you're writing for something like BuzzFeed, you could very well have a direct mode of address. It could be very informal. It could be a bit humorous, okay? Because that's the kind of mode of address they're more likely to use. It's going to be more suitable to the audience, okay? Okie dokie, bias. Bias is quite an important one, okay? And it is something that we could spend a hell of a lot of time talking about with regards to newspapers. But put it simply, bias means to take a particular side, okay? You'd like to think that most, especially factual writing, is going to be a little bit more, a little bit more balanced, okay? But, especially if you're looking at things like newspapers especially, there is often a lot of bias that goes on, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later on. But it's not just about does the piece of writing have a bias, it's about how does the piece of writing encourage the reader to take the same side that they have. So The Sun, they do have quite a strong political bias, okay? They have a political bias towards the Conservative Party, okay? So Boris Johnson, that lot. So for the general election in 2015, they did 2015, I can't remember what day it was, what year it was. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They produced a lot of content that was very biased against Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the Labour Party, okay? Because they were trying to encourage people not to vote for him. So they used a lot of different techniques in their writing to promote that bias. So especially through things like the pictures that they used, obviously, okay, but also things like the languages, okay? They use words like hypocrite, okay? They use lefty, which is slang for someone who is on the left side of the political spectrum, okay? But it's a bit of a derogatory term as well, okay? They use the headline court jester to, create the impression of Jeremy Corbyn being a bit of a joker, okay? Someone who's not to be taken seriously, okay? Some examples of bias, though, are not quite that in your face, because that is quite an obvious one, okay? And if you Google the son Jeremy Corbyn, there is about 1 billion examples of how they try to promote their bias for their particular point of view, okay? But it could be a bit more subtle, all right? If you look at something like, I don't know, Heat magazine, there is often a lot of times where Heat magazine will use sources to, promote their bias, okay? They might use more reliable sources for someone whose side they take, and someone whose side they don't want to take, they might use more unreliable sources, or they might not use sources at all. So sometimes pieces of writing that promote bias will use very subtle ways of promoting their bias, okay? A lot of publications will argue that they're impartial, but that's not always the case, okay? Oh, where have I gone now? Okay, elaborate and restricted code. Now, this is quite an important theory from a man called Basil Bernstein, and it relates to the language that you might use and audience's understanding of that language. So, restricted code it's the idea that the language that you might use in any form of written, it doesn't need to be written text, any form of communication, so it could be a newspaper article, it could be any sort of articles, but it could also be things like a voiceover script for an advert or a promotional script for a TV show. But it's the idea that the language that you use, you require some prior understanding to be able to decipher the language that you might use. And it assumes that the person who is consuming this piece of writing has that understanding. Okay? So what do we mean by that? I might very well see a headline in Heat magazine that uses the abbreviation TOWIE. Okay? Or it might say something like, this is me not showing my knowledge about anything that's in Heat magazine now. It might say something like, I don't know, strictly in a headline, okay? Now, what that writer is doing there is they assume that the reader knows what TOWIE stands for, okay? And it assumes they know that strictly is obviously slang for Strictly Come Dancing, okay? And that's a quite simple example of restricted code. It's assuming the reader knows these things already, okay? So for example, if you were looking at that from Heat magazine, you would be very safe to assume that the reader of Heat magazine would know what TOWIE stands for. You don't need to explain it, you don't need to put it in full detail, because you assume they know, okay? And that's essentially what we mean by restricted code. Okay, it doesn't necessarily need to be about abbreviations or something like that. It could be anything. It could be the language that you might use. You might use some sort of slang. Okay, you might use some sort of colloquialisms or conversational language. Okay, it might even assume that you have some prior understanding of an actual topic that you've been talking about. Okay, it might be something like, I don't know, it might say something like, I don't know, if you put it in conversational terms, you might say something like, oh, Boris is up to it again. Okay, or Kia is up to it again. Okay, now if you know who Boris is and you know who Kia is and you know anything about politics, then you will probably understand what that means. So it's restricted code. Whereas if you don't know what that means, it's you're not going to understand it. Okay, whereas elaborate code is language that does not assume the reader has this prior knowledge. Okay. So you will need to explain that. So it might, instead of saying TOWIE, it would say the only way is Essex. It might even say something like the only way is Essex, a pointless reality TV show. Okay? But it assumes that the reader doesn't have this knowledge. Okay? It goes into more detail. And again, that will completely depend on the publication you're writing for and its audience. If you were, I don't know, writing an article on politics for Heat magazine, which is unlikely, you're probably going to have a bit more use of elaborate code there. Whereas if you're writing an article on Love Island for Heat magazine, you're probably going to have more restricted code on there. Okay? In fact, it's probably the opposite of that for The Guardian. If you're writing an article on Love Island for The Guardian, then you'll probably need to use more elaborate code. Okay? However, if you're writing an article on politics for The Guardian, you could probably get away with using more restricted code. Okay? Okay, last one's quite a simple one, is credibility. Okay? Now, credibility, we're referring to the actual reliability of the article and to what extent do we trust it. Not necessarily to what extent do we trust the actual article itself or the writer, but also things like its sources. Okay, one of the main things that people tend to not do these days, which is a bit depressing, is that they don't think about where the information comes from. Okay, you know, if you read an article and it has no sources at all to back up its claims, how reliable is that? How credible is it? Okay, is it credible at all? Okay, you know, if it has any stats or statistics, where do they come from? Okay, even if it has sources there, it tells you the sources. Are they reliable sources? Okay, if you were writing an article on, I don't know, something to do with COVID, and you were talking about the number of infections or whatever, and you got the quotes from, I don't know, Colin's COVID blog, it's probably not going to be that reliable. Whereas if the numbers came from NHS, okay, the World Health Organization, they're probably going to be more reliable. Okay, so these are the things you've got to think about. Okay, to what extent are the sources that you've used reliable? Okay, does it speculate as well? Okay, does it ask rhetorical questions? Okay, that have no grounding and no sort of background to them, no substance. Okay, and finally, does it differentiate between fact and opinion? Okay, to what extent is the article you're writing about someone's opinion? Okay, realistically, if you're writing something that's based on factual news, you should be representing fact. It shouldn't be about your opinion. Okay, if you're writing about an article on, that's a bit of a sad example, but something like gun violence, okay, and a news story, you're not there to give your opinion, you're there to give me the facts, unless it's an opinion piece. But if it is an opinion piece, you should differentiate that this is your opinion, this is what you think, okay, it's not facts, okay. So credibility is a very, very important one, okay. So that's everything we need to go through. These are the things that you need to be considering when you write any piece of journalism. Okay, you've got to be thinking about the structure. Okay, so the headline, the byline, the hook, stand first, main body, payoff, and lead out. Okay, are they in the right place? Do they serve the purpose? But also you want to be thinking about the readability as well. Okay, now the readability will obviously all be very different depending on who it is you're writing for. Okay, have you got the register spot on? Okay, have you used the right amount of elaborate and restricted code? Is it credible? Okay, have you referenced your sources? That sort of stuff. Okay, that's pretty much it. That's all I need to go through with you guys. Any questions, anything you don't understand, feel free to send me an email. I'll try and go through it a bit better with you. But that's it.